I just thought, well, what's the point of this? I thought I'm quite capable of being relatively happy on my own, and I'm not able to be happy in this situation. You know, I'm getting out of here.
Number nine. Number nine.
It just built up. It built up. The bigger we got, the more unreality we had to face. You know, the more we were expected to do, until when you didn't sort of shake hands with the mayor's wife, she started abusing you and screaming or saying how dare they. And there's one of Derek's stories where we were asleep after the session, you know, in the hotel somewhere in America, and the mayor's wife comes and says, you know, get them up, I want to meet them, you know. And Derek saying, I'm not going to wake them up. And she starts saying, you get them up, I'll tell the press. And it was always that. They were always threatening what they would tell the press about us. The bad publicity if we didn't see their bloody daughter and were there.
So that's what happened. I just got up and I thought, well, I'm not doing this anymore. You know, I'm out of here. And so I got my guitar and I just went home.
You got too rich, you got too isolated, you got too tired. Lennon got too radical. What's your version?
That we'd come full circle.
1962 was the year the Beatles' career began. Officially, you could say they began in 1958 when Paul would introduce his friend George Harrison to the band. But 62 was the year the group would sign with a major label and release their first single, though it was also a turbulent year for the group. Their trips to Hamburg had transformed them as live performers from rusty amateurs to a solid unit. They met Brian Epstein in late 1961, who immediately saw a star quality in them. That year, their former bass player and close friend of John's, Stuart Sutcliffe, had been having health issues. By late 61, when he visited Liverpool for the holidays, he looked very sick, pale, thin, and constantly complained of headaches. January 1st, the Beatles, looking to secure a record deal, were auditioned by Decca Records. They performed 15 songs in the space of an hour. Of the 15 songs, only 3 are Lennon-McCartney originals. Side note, the audition was recorded with some of the songs appearing on the Beatles' Anthology 1. The masters were sold in 2012 for £35,000. Though it is disputed these are actually the original masters and believed they are still in the possession of Apple Corps. After the audition, Decca decided to pass on the Beatles and sign Brian, Paul and the Tremolos instead. The decision will go down as one of the biggest mistakes in music history. Though in fairness, their performance that day gave no indication of the potentials the Beatles held. Side note, Decca, desperate to make up for this blunder, later signed the Rolling Stones. Keith Richards later said the only reason they had a career was because of the Beatles. 4 days later, Mersey Beat take a poll and the Beatles are named the best group in Liverpool. A day later, their first official single, My Bonnie, is released. My Bonnie was actually a Tony Sheridan song featuring the Beatles, but technically it was their first single. The single was sent to record companies around London with requests for an audition. Brian had been unofficially acting as their manager for the last 7 months or so. He was pushing them into a clean-cut image and insisted John's girlfriend Cynthia and Paul's girlfriend Dot did not attend any Beatles gigs. Brian figured they were a distraction for the group who needed to become more professional and that also put off female fans. As January comes to an end, the Beatles sign a contract officially appointing Brian Epstein as their manager. The contract states he will take 10% of their earnings. By February, despite 2 other major labels rejecting them, Brian assured them that their record deal was inevitable. In truth, he himself was doubting it. Brian just couldn't understand why Decca had passed. He was so sure they would have signed the group. Brian insisted Decca's A&R man or talent spotter Dick Rowe meet with him. He did, and over a dinner meeting, cemented his rejection of the Beatles. Brian was irate. He snapped Rowe was making the biggest mistake of his career. In response, Brian was told to give up managing musical groups and stick to something he was good at. It was a big blow. Brian had promised the Beatles the Decca contract was all but finalised. Now Brian had to tell the group it wasn't to be. They were none too pleased. They'd been adjusting their act and taking direction from Brian, and now they wanted to see results. February 5th, Pete Best is unable to perform at the Cavern Club and calls in sick. Ringo Starr replaces him for the gig. A week later, Brian Epstein meets with head of Parlophone Records George Martin. Brian proclaims the Beatles are brilliant and will soon conquer the world. Martin knew full well they'd been rejected by other labels, but he was won over by Epstein's devotion to his group. Martin was less impressed when he heard the Decca tapes. He felt their original songs were, in his words, very mediocre. Though a positive point was John and Paul's voice, he couldn't make a decision going by what he just heard alone. He told Brian to bring the group to London and he'd work with them in the studio. That would tell him all he needed to know about the Beatles. Brian didn't like the sound of another audition. It would mean another trip to London, similar to the last one with Decca, and that couldn't have gone worse. All the time, financially, this was costing Brian more and more. But one thing Brian never seemed to care about was investing money into the Beatles. April 11th, the Beatles travelled to Hamburg to play from the 13th to the 31st of May. On their arrival, John meets Astrid, Stuart Sutcliffe's girlfriend, who informs him Stuart died. She tells John about his headaches, how he'd become so ill she insisted he move into her house, and her attic had been converted into an art studio for him. A day before the Beatles had left for Hamburg, Stuart had died in an ambulance on the way to hospital. While in Hamburg, John begins drinking heavily. He turns up to gigs drunk, starts fights, and is generally unpleasant to be around. Not that the other Beatles say anything, or even see it as an issue. This to them is just John being John. Meanwhile, John's girlfriend Cynthia's moved into a flat with Paul's girlfriend Dot keeping her company. By the time May hits, Brian Epstein is desperate to follow up on his promise to get the Beatles signed. It seems now his only option is the audition offered by George Martin. Brian schedules a meeting with George Martin, intending to charm him. He does, and they work out a deal where Parlophone will sign the Beatles, but should their audition go badly, Martin will not add his signature, making the contract worthless. By May, the flat next to Cynthia becomes vacant, and Dot moves in with Paul paying her rent. June 2nd, the Beatles return to Liverpool. John's eager to see Cynthia and the new flat she's moved into. When he arrives, Cynthia announces she's pregnant. She later recalled John going completely white. His disappointment was impossible to hide. John later confessed, at that moment he thought it was the end of the Beatles. He felt the right thing to do was to marry Cynthia. 4 days later, the Beatles travel to London for an audition with George Martin. When they arrive, they are surprised by the Abbey Road building. It doesn't look like a recording studio. In fact, it's a 9-bedroom house that has been converted into a studio. They enter Abbey Road thinking how small the place is. Little do they realise, a building has been built in the place of the garden and joined on to the main house. Abbey Road was huge. Pete Best remembered them all being nervous. They leave their equipment and head to the canteen to meet George Martin. After this, they record a few songs and George Martin isn't terribly impressed. He thinks them lousy songwriters. George and another producer go over all of their faults, holding back only one. They believe Pete Best is a terrible drummer. If they were to record the Beatles properly, they will need a replacement drummer. Aside from their music, George Martin loves their personalities. He agrees to meet them again. In the following weeks, Paul's girlfriend Dot breaks the news of her pregnancy. Paul plans to marry her later in the year. During July, Dot miscarries. August 15th, Ringo Starr is asked to join the Beatles. The other Beatles agree Pete Best should be replaced. They also are tired of his mother Mona, who likes to have her say on their business. Mona was forever in disputes with Brian Epstein, who always referred to her as that woman and not by her name. At the time, Mona was also in a relationship with the Beatles road manager Neil Aspinall. One day later, Pete Best is sacked. Brian Epstein informs him, "The boys want you out and Ringo in." When he asks why, Brian replies, "They don't think you're a good enough drummer, and George Martin doesn't think you're a good enough drummer." Pete agrees to play the remaining gigs they have booked, then leaves. After the meeting, Pete tells Neil Aspinall of the news, and the two go out drinking in a pub near the Cavern. Aspinall vows to quit as tour manager in protest. August 19th, Ringo plays with the Beatles as their official drummer. It was a rough gig. The crowd, angry with Pete Best's dismissal, chant, "Pete forever, Ringo never." The crowd continues to heckle throughout the gig, and eventually George tells the audience to shut up. After the show, one of the attendees headbutts him outside. 4 days later, John marries Cynthia at a registry office, and Paul ends his relationship with Dot. September 4th, the Beatles return to Abbey Road Studios to record their first single, Love Me Do. That day, they all wore suits they had for John's wedding. In Studio 3, they record for 3 hours. George Martin tries to convince them to record a song called How Do You Do It and release it instead of Love Me Do. They refuse. Brian insists the group wear mohair suits at every gig. John later stated he felt that they were selling out by dropping the leather jackets in favour of suits. Side note, George Harrison's leather jacket later went up for sale in 2012, fetching over £110,000 at auction. October 5th, Love Me Do is broadcast on the radio. It receives little attention. The single is also released that day. It sells well and reaches number 17 on the singles charts. At the time, Paul's ex-girlfriend Dot was living in a flat near John and Cynthia. John had shown a lot of compassion following the breakup. He even paid her rent when she was broke. November 26th, a session takes place at Abbey Road for a follow-up to Love Me Do. George Martin again pushes the band to record How Do You Do It. George is certain this will be a hit. Again, they refuse. Side note, How Do You Do It was later given to Jerry and the Pacemakers and shot to the top of the charts. It doesn't matter though. That day, the Beatles record Please Please Me, and after the session is finished, George Martin tells them, "Gentlemen, you've just made your first #1 record." The year ends with the Beatles performing gigs around the UK. At this point, they're still only big in Liverpool, but Beatlemania will soon begin.
Thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated, as this is my main source of income. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and however much you wish to donate. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for my next video.